Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off, I'm gonna find a way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you tell me? I wanna hear your sorrow. To me, we'll make a new tomorrow. Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off, I'm gonna find a way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you tell me? I wanna hear your sorrow. To me, we'll make a new tomorrow.
Good evening. How are you all tonight? Okay. We are up to part 7, reading in Forbidden History. And we got 2 articles tonight, and then next week we'll do 3 articles because they're all short, and that will take us through into the next section of the book, which is going to be pretty interesting. A whole different section of and type of stuff. It looks like it may be on Atlantis or the origins of civilization, which there's one on Atlantis, there's one on Plato, so that's going to be about Atlantis. So the next section's all Atlantis stuff, which is going to be interesting. But we've got 5 articles to get through, and there's no way my voice will hold out for 5 all in one go. So we're going to read 2 tonight and 3 next week. So the ones tonight. New studies confirm very old Sphinx. Orthodox protests notwithstanding, evidence for the Schock West/West thesis is growing, by Robert M. Schock, Ph.D. And then the next one, well, I'll announce it when I get to it. All right. So here we go. For the past 10 years, I have been working closely with John Anthony West on the redating of the Great Sphinx of Giza. The traditional date for the statue is circa 2500 BCE, but based on my geological analysis, I am convinced that the oldest portions of the Sphinx date back to at least circa 5000 BCE, and John West believes that it may be considerably older still. Such a chronology, however, goes against not just classical Egyptology, but also many long-held assumptions concerning the dating and origin of early civilizations. I cannot recall how many times I have been told by erstwhile university colleagues that such an early date for the Sphinx is simply impossible because humans were technologically and socially incapable of such feats that long ago, yet I must follow where the evidence leads. Interesting, because this was 20 years ago, remember. And now Göbekli Tepe has completely blown that idea out of the water. Uh, my research into the age of the Great Sphinx led me to ultimately question many aspects of the traditional scientific worldview that to this day permeates most of academe. I got to a point where there were so many new ideas buzzing around in my head that I felt I had to organize them on paper. And this led me to co-author the book Voices of the Rocks, A Scientist Looks at Catastrophes and Ancient Civilizations with Robert Aquinas McNally in 1999. The manuscript for Voices of the Rocks was completed in August 98. Since that time, I have learned of two independent geological studies of the Great Sphinx and its age. These studies go a long way toward both supporting my analysis and conclusions and rebutting the inadequate counterarguments of the topics. Pause. In both cases, they corroborate the primary conclusions of my original studies of the Great Sphinx, namely that the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure show evidence of significant precipitation-induced weathering and erosion degradation. And the core body of the Sphinx and the oldest portions of the Sphinx temple predate the pharaohs Khafre, 2500 BCE, and Khufu or Cheops, a predecessor of Khafre, reigned about 2551 to 2528 BCE. The first study was undertaken by the geologist David Coxill, Coxill. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, so I'm going to say Coxill, and published in an article entitled The Riddle of the Sphinx in Inscription Journal of Ancient Egypt. After confirming my observations on the weathering and erosion of the Sphinx and pointing out that other explanations do not work, Coxill clearly states, quote, this, the data analysis he covers in the preceding portion of his paper, implies that the Sphinx is at least 5,000 years old and predates dynastic times, end quote. Coxill then discusses very briefly the seismic work that Thomas Dobecki and I pursued, and my estimate of an initial date of 5,000 to 7,000 BCE for the earliest parts of the Sphinx based on the seismic data. He neither supports nor refutes this portion of my work, but simply writes, quote, absolute dates for the sculpturing of the Sphinx should be taken with extreme caution, and therefore dates should be as conservative as possible until more conclusive evidence comes to light, end quote. I can understand that he could take this stance, although perhaps I feel more comfortable with and confident in the seismic analysis we did. Coxill, in the next paragraph of his paper, continues, quote, nevertheless, I don't know why I keep saying Sphinx. I'm trying to say Phoenix and Sphinx at the same time, and I don't know why I keep doing that tonight. The Sphinx is clearly older than the traditional date for the origins of the Sphinx. But nevertheless, the Sphinx, is clearly older than the traditional date for the origins of the Sphinx in the reign of Khafre, 2520 to 2490 BCE. End quote. Sorry about that. That was a rough one. Bottom line, Coxill agrees with the heart of my analysis and likewise concludes that the oldest portions of the Sphinx date to before dynastic times, that is, prior to circa 3000 BCE. Another geologist, Colin Reeder, who holds a degree in geological engineering from London University, has also pursued a meticulous study of weathering and erosion degradation features on the body of the Sphinx and in the Sphinx enclosure. This he has combined with a detailed analysis of the ancient hydrology of the Giza Plateau, which has been published in an article entitled A Geomorphological Study of the Giza Necropolis with Implications for the Development of the Site, published in Archaeometry. Like Coxel, Reeder points out the problems and weaknesses in the arguments of my opponents. Reeder notes that there is, quote, a marked increase in the intensity of the degradation, that is, weathering and erosion, toward the western end of the Sphinx enclosure. Reeder continues, in my opinion, the only mechanism that can fully explain this increase in intensity is the action of rainfall runoff discharging into the Sphinx enclosure from the higher plateau in the north and west. However, large quarries worked during the reign of Khufu, as noted above, a predecessor of Khafre, the traditional builder of the Sphinx, and located immediately upslope, will have prevented any significant runoff reaching the Sphinx. Thus, end quote, thus, Reeder concludes that quote, when considered in terms of the hydrology of the site, the distribution of degradation within the Sphinx enclosure indicates that the excavation of the Sphinx predates Khufu's early 4th dynasty development at Giza, end quote. Interestingly, Reeder also concludes that the so-called Khafre's Causeway, running from the area of the Sphinx Temple and Khafre Valley Temple up to the Mortuary Temple on the eastern side of the Khafre Pyramid, part of Khafre's Mortuary Temple, which Reeder refers to as the Proto-Mortuary Temple, and the Sphinx Temple predate the reign of Khufu. That was a very long sentence. So all this stuff, Reeder concludes that the so-called Khafre's Causeway, which is part of all this stuff, and the Sphinx Temple predate the reign of Khufu. So that's what it said, without all that other stuff in between that can kind of makes it a confusing sentence. I have come out strongly in favor of not only an older Sphinx, but also a contemporaneous, thus older, Sphinx Temple, at least the limestone core being older than the 4th dynasty. Independently of Reeder, John Anthony West and I have also concluded that part of Khafre's Mortuary Temple predates Khafre. Ugh, sorry, not meaning to yawn. My breathing must be off from my reading. Khafre's Mortuary Temple predates Khafre, but I had not published this conclusion or spoken of it at length in public, as I wanted to collect more corroborative evidence first. Reeder has now come to the same conclusion concerning Khafre's Mortuary Temple. I am pleased to see his confirmation. I believe that there was much more human activity at Giza in pre-Old Kingdom times than has previously been recognized. I even suspect that the second, or Khafre pyramid, may actually sit on top of an older site or structure. According to the Egyptologists John Baines and Joramir Malik, and as discussed in their book Atlas of Ancient Egypt, the Khafre Pyramid in ancient times was referred to as the Great Pyramid, while the Khufu Pyramid, referred to in modern times as the Great Pyramid, was known in antiquity as the pyramid which is the place of sunrise and sunset. Does the ancient designation of the Great Pyramid for the Khafre Pyramid indicate that the site, if not the pyramid itself, was of supreme importance and predated many other developments and structures on the Giza Plateau. Reader tentatively dates the excavation of the Sphinx and the construction of the Sphinx Temple, Proto-Mortuary Temple, and Caffrey's Causeway to, quote, someone in the latter half of the early dynastic period, end quote. That is circa 2800 to 2600 BCE, on the basis of, again, quote, the known use of stone in ancient Egyptian architecture, end quote. I believe that readers' estimated date for the excavation of the earliest portions of the Sphinx is later than the evidence indicates. I would make three general points. One, in my opinion, the nature and degree of weathering and erosion, degradation, on the Sphinx and in the Sphinx enclosure is much different from what would be expected if the Sphinx had not been carved until 2800 BCE or even 3000 BCE. Also, mud brick mastabas on the Saqqara Plateau dated to circa 2800 BCE show no evidence of significant rain weathering, indicating just how dry the climate has been for the last 5,000 years. I continue to believe that the erosional features on the Sphinx and in the Sphinx enclosure indicate a date much earlier than 3000 or 2800 BCE. In my opinion, it strains credibility to believe that the amount, type, and degree of precipitation-induced erosion seen in the Sphinx enclosure was produced in only a few centuries. Reader points out, as I have previously, that even the Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, one of the most ardent opponents when it comes to my redating of the Sphinx, contends that some of the weathering and erosion interpreted as precipitation induced by Reader, Coxall, and me on the body of the Sphinx was covered over and repaired during Old Kingdom times. Thus we can safely assume that the initial core body of the Sphinx was carved out much earlier. 2. Reader never addresses the seismic work that we pursued around the Sphinx, which is in part the basis I used to calibrate a crude estimate for the age of the earliest excavations in the Sphinx enclosure. In my opinion, the date estimate based on our seismic work is compatible with the type and amount of erosion and weathering seen in the Sphinx enclosure, and also nicely correlates with the known paleoclimatic history of the Giza Plateau. Some of my critics have suggested that our seismic studies simply recorded subsurface layers of rock rather than weathering per se. Here I would point out that the differential weathering pattern that we recorded in the subsurface cuts across the dip of the rock layers and parallels the floor of the enclosure as is to be expected of weathering. Furthermore, the dramatically shallower depth of the low velocity layer immediately behind the rump of the Sphinx is totally incompatible with the notion that the seismic data simply records original bedding in the limestone. And 3. I do not find dating the Sphinx on the basis of the, quote, the known use of stone in ancient Egyptian architecture, end quote, convincing. I would point out that massive stonework constructions were being carried out millennia earlier than circa 2800 BCE in other parts of the Mediterranean, for instance at Jericho in Palestine. Even in Egypt, it is now acknowledged that megalithic structures were being erected at Nabta, west of Abu Simbel, in Upper Egypt by the 5th millennium BCE, and the pre-dynastic Libyan Palette, circa 31 to 3000 BCE, now housed in the Cairo Museum, records fortified cities which may well have included architectural stonework along the western edge of the Nile Delta at a very early date. I find it quite conceivable that the architectural stonework was being pursued at Giza prior to 2800 or 3000 BCE. Bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, Reeder is one more geologist who has corroborated my basic observations and conclusions. The oldest portions of the Sphinx date back to a period well before circa 2500 BCE. It is It is not only concerning the date of this Sphinx that there have been significant developments since the original publication of Voices of the Rocks. In June 1999, I participated in an amazing conference organized by Professor Emilio Spedicato of the University of Bergamo entitled New Scenarios for the Solar System, Evolution and Consequences in History of Earth and Man, at which he forgot the end of the quote for the title, at which I was invited to speak on the age of the Sphinx. A number of scientists and researchers attended this conference, representing many alternative, heretical, and catastrophic viewpoints. In particular, the University of Vienna geologist Professor Alexander Tolman discussed the work pursued by him in conjunction with his late wife, Edith Tolman. The Tolmans accumulated a mass of evidence supporting cometary impacts with Earth at the end of the last ice age. Between some 13,000 and 9,500 years ago, between 1100 and 7500 BCE. Another important researcher attending the New Scenarios conference was Dr. Mike Bailey, a dendrochronologist, one who studies tree rings, at the Queen's University in Belfast. Further supporting themes developed in Voices of the Rocks, Bailey has documented a series of narrowest ring events in the Irish oak tree ring chronology at the following dates: 3195 BCE, 2345 BCE, 1628 BCE, 1159 BCE, 207 BCE, and 540 CE. As Bailey pointed out, these dates mark major environmental downturns and also the general time periods of major disruptions and changes in the history of human civilizations. Bailey also noted that some or all of these dates may be associated with cometary activity influencing Earth. Indeed, I believe that these dates, along with the date of 1178 CE, elucidated by Professor Spedicato, may all represent periods of more or less intense cometary impacts somewhere on our planet. Also note that these dates appear to follow a roughly 500 to 1,000 year cycle. Looking at each of these dates in turn, we can take a few casual observations and speculations. 3195 BCE. Possibly this marks the final end of the Sphinx culture, a time that the Great Sphinx and other very ancient megalithic monuments were built, which, due to its collapse and the resulting cultural vacuum, paved the way for the dynastic culture of Egypt and other Mediterranean civilizations and the development of writing as we know it. 2345 BCE, the early Bronze Age crisis. 1628 BCE, the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, dynastic changes in China. 1159 BCE, the end of the Bronze Age. 207 BCE, social disruptions in China and the Far East, the decline of various Hellenistic empires in the circum-Mediterranean region that cleared the way for the dominance of the Roman Empire. 540 CE, collapse of the traditional Roman Empire, which ended the ancient world and set off the Dark Ages. 1178 CE, social unrest and turmoil, particularly in the Pacific region and Asia, including the rise of the Mongols under Genghis Khan. Based on the patterns above, I will not be surprised if our planet experiences another major cometary encounter during the 21st or early 22nd centuries. This predicted future event may have already been foreshadowed by the 1908 extraterrestrial impact, I believe it was cometary in origin, in the Tunguska region of Siberia. Extraterrestrial events have recently been acknowledged as also playing a major role in the development of human culture in the very distant past. The March 3, 2000 issue of Science magazine includes an article on stone tools from southern China dated to approximately 800,000 years ago. What is particularly interesting about these tools is their association with tektites, glassy fragments of molten rock that resulted from meteorite impact, the result of a comet or asteroid colliding with our planet. It seems that the impact scorched the landscape, dramatically altered the local environment, exposed the rocks from which the stone tools were ultimately manufactured, and paved the way for early human innovation. In the devastation of the impact and its aftermath, new opportunities for cultural development arose. Clearly, the evidence continues to accumulate that extraterrestrial and, in particular, cometary events have directly influenced the course of human civilization. I stand by the ideas presented and themes discussed in Voices of the Rocks. More than ever, I believe we must learn from the past even as we prepare for the future. Let us hope that we learn in time. It's interesting, normally when you hear extraterrestrial, people aren't talking about um, comets, but it is a perfectly suitable way of using that term. It's just people see extraterrestrial and automatically think, oh, ET, aliens. No, it just means something not of this world. So a comet, a meteorite, any of that. So that's the end of the first um, article. Now there are some color pages here. I don't know if they're just stuck in the book at this point, or if they actually have to do with one of the articles, like the article I just read, because it doesn't really indicate that. So I thought, just for shits and giggles, or giggles and shits, whichever you prefer, I'm going to read those real quick and show the pictures as best I can. So, yeah. So the first picture says, could the Veils Marineris on Mars be the lightning scar of the mythical god of war? That is from one of the earlier articles we read about the idea, and I think it comes partly from this Lubitz guy, Schwaller de Lubitz. Or no, it was oh heck, what's his name? Um, Damn it, I'm just totally blanking on his name. Um, it'll come to me, but um, it's the theory. Velikovsky, Emmanuel Velikovsky. Um, that comes from part of his theory, as I recall, and I may be a little bit off there, but so that is the first picture. This one here. Eh, really got to get used to that. So it's this scar they're talking about right here. Okay. The second, Venus as seen by the Hubble Space Telescope, is thought to have been a major player in a series of global catastrophes recorded all over the world. And then I'll go ahead and read the third one. The Crab Nebula, as seen from the Hubble Space Telescope, the lower of the two large stars seen in the box, is the Crab pulsar, which emits optical as well as electromagnetic pulses. So here's, sorry about the glare, and it's going to glare on it because of the light on the camera. But this one here is Venus, and then that one over here, the lower one, is the Crab Nebula. Okay, now we move on to some stuff from the Sphinx, pictures of the Sphinx. So above, two views of the Great Sphinx of Egypt, and the bottom right, eroded stone in the Sphinx enclosure provides clear evidence of the kind of water weathering that could result only from long-term precipitation. The inescapable inference is that the Sphinx is at least 2,500 years older than previously believed by Orthodox Egyptologists. So, three pictures of the Sphinx, right? Those two. We'll get to that, to this in a minute. So, God, everything's backwards. Sorry. So, and then this bottom one here is showing the erosion. If you can see that. And you may have seen pictures of that before. So, boy, there's a bunch of these. So the next one gets into the pyramids. So, shown above are the three pyramids of Giza, named for the three pharaohs who are said to have built them. Left to right, Menkaure, Khafre, and Khufu, the Great Pyramid. The photograph to the left shows the casing stones that once encased the pyramid of Khafre. All that is left of the casing stone lies on the top of the pyramid. The photograph to the left is of the ascending gallery of the Great Pyramid. Its actual function remains a mystery, although there are many theories. And below is the entrance to the southern shaft from the Queen's Chamber, which was first explored in March 1993 by Rudolf Gantenbrink's robot. So I remember hearing about that robot when it was happening. So yeah, damn it, sorry. So the three pyramids, and then this is the casing stones right here. The King's Chamber shaft, and then the shaft from the Queen's Chamber. This little square. Man. This little square. They sent a little tracked robot through that. It had a cap in it, and they sent a robot with a camera into it, and it came up to a certain point there where there was another cap, and it couldn't go any further, as I recall. I'm pretty sure that's how it went. And they were trying to figure out, the last time I paid attention, they were trying to figure out how to remove that cap, and they couldn't figure out how the cap got there to begin with, or the plug, I should say, got there to begin with. Because as far as they can tell, there's no way to have gotten it there by hand. It had to have put in, they think, the theory was, they basically plugged the bottom and then dropped in the plug, and they'd already built into the wall of that tube a place where the plug would stop, and then they plugged the top of the tube as well, for whatever reason. And that kind of goes along with theories that the different parts of and tubes and chambers were actually used for certain purposes as the pyramid was being built, and once it was fully enclosed, those chambers and tubes and whatnot couldn't be used for that anymore because it was all enclosed, which is, kind of an interesting theory. I guess the whole idea would be to preserve all of it intact with this outer casing that would protect it for basically ever. Um, I think the rest of these are going to have to do with later parts of the book, so I'm going to skip them because it gets into pyramids and stuff in Mexico, and it looks like maybe Stonehenge and the Piri Reis map. All stuff we haven't read about yet from the book, so I'm going to skip them. And we'll go on to R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz's magnum opus, The Keys to Understanding the Wisdom of the Ancients Have Been Preserved. So, Joseph, and this is by Joseph Ray, PhD, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages, but it's got 3 big pictures, so it's really only 7 pages. So here we go. From time to time, significant events occur unbeknownst to virtually everyone. Great discoveries, formidable inventions, and even profound legacies have been delivered to humanity in relatively Suddenly I have a tickle in my throat. Sorry. Have been delivered to humanity in relative obscurity and sometimes against its unconscious collective will. Such an event occurred in late 1998 with the publication of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz's greatest work, The Temple of Man. The Temple of Man is an accomplishment of truly Herculean proportions. Nothing written in the past 200 years, with the exception of only one book, even approaches it in enormity of purpose, scope, subject matter, majesty, and profundity. It is also physically enormous, as well as beautiful, and to read it properly is a year's commitment. To comprehend it and finally to understand it may require additional years of effort. Rereading, pondering, and most significantly, revelation. One needs to learn to read this book and then immerse oneself in it. Were one to do this, and assuming diligence, sincerity, determination, and some ingenuity by the reader, the outcome toward which all human life is aimed, the evolution of consciousness is ensured. Quote, consciousness cannot evolve unconsciously, said G.I. Gurdjieff. His great work, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, conveys much of the occult and profound teachings set forth in the Temple of Man, requires similar effort, and can exert a similar effect upon the reader. That's one thing I haven't read. I have some Gurdjieff, but I haven't read it, and that will be part of this ongoing series. So when we get closer to needing our poll, don't be surprised if Gurdjieff shows up. Velikovsky most definitely will on this first poll. Essential in both is the reader's open-mindedness and state of receptivity, produced by consciously suspending mental reactions until the teachers, the ancient sages whose mode of thought is being transmitted, have completed their work, and the transcribers of this knowledge, the authors, have exhausted their understanding. Every man who attempts to fathom the profound expresses himself about it uniquely. This includes his turns of phrase, the ordering of his thoughts, and the very manner in which he thinks, by hops, leaps, and bounds, one rung at a time, or in a direct line. To become his student, which is to say, to place oneself in a state of maximum sensitivity to the ideas he expresses, one must familiarize oneself with his turns of phrase and mode of expression. To the extent that one becomes able to think, reason, and ponder in a fashion similar to one's teacher, a psychological fusion can occur. This fusion, by a sort of inner resonance in the reader-student, metaphorically speaking, shakes loose the embedded knowledge from its innate repository, the intelligence of the heart, and a fresh understanding emerges. The more subtle, oblique, and ineffable knowledge is, the less suited is the cerebral intelligence to it, and the more it will react against it. Quote, knowledge, or even elements of the knowledge, cannot be conveyed through writing alone. The symbol of the image is indispensable. End quote. Schwaller de Lubitz says. The symbolic then is the concrete image of a synthesis that cannot be expressed in time. And it is these images that evoke the synthesis. It may sound awkward, but the process is straightforward. True symbols appear to the intelligence of the heart, where they draw knowledge from it. Ordinary language and the thought expressed in it, the currencies of cerebral intelligence, are ill suited to this knowledge and always distort it. However, not only the pharaonic mode of thought, but in mode of perception as well, differed from our own. We are, says Schwaller de Lubitz, the victims of our own mechanistic mentality, and as such suffer from a materialistic misunderstanding of nature. It is worth noting that ever since Schwaller de Lubitz's time, materialism has further extended its grip on human thought. Today, despite inaccuracy and verbal inefficiency, practically everything is described in terms of amount, e.g., a fair amount of knowledge, accuracy, time, skill, speed, and/or any psychological resource. Not everything is quantity or volume. To become adept at the pharaonic mode requires effort, suffering, and experiment. Two shorter works by Schwaller de Lubitz, Nature's Word and The Temple in Man, are desirable precursors to The Temple of Man, either new or in rereading. The casual readers need not be deterred either, for they may discover themselves being hooked by the beauty, interconnectedness, and depth of these extraordinary teachings of the ancient sages. This knowledge is for those willing to struggle, and Schwaller de Lubitz warns against concluding, quote, that the ancients meant to say something that we understand. Rather, one should try to find out why they expressed themselves thus, end quote. The Temple of Man, actually, before I continue that, because it breaks off in the middle of the paragraph, there is a picture here. And it is, the caption says, the temple at Luxor superimposed over a human skeleton with sacred geometric proportions demonstrated by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz. Interesting. Okay. So let's see if I can do this right the first time. I can't. All right. So so you can see the outline of the skeleton all the way down. And that is the Temple of Luxor, at least the outline of it. Okay. And the sacred geometry also. The Temple of Man is not a straightforward presentation of ancient teachings, nor is it Schwaller de Lubitz's own path, recounted in somewhat objectified form, but based upon his personal discoveries and illuminations. It is both and much more. Schwaller de Lubitz assimilated what the ancients taught. He allowed himself to be affected, impacted emotionally, by the symbolic language transcribed into the Temple of Luxor. This language transcends ordinary language, is vital and not dead, and thus is the only means of transmitting the ineffable to future humanity free of distortion. The Temple of Luxor is a pedagogical device, built to embody and encode knowledge through the use of variety of subtle cues, e.g., the representation of an incorrect anatomical detail such as two left hands, a missing detail present on the other side of a wall. Painstakingly, the ancients integrated occult knowledge into visual, auditory, conceptual, and architectural symbolic expressions. In so doing, they specifically intended to bypass cerebral intelligence. And here is another picture of the Temple of Luxor. There we go. If you've never been there, which I have not, and I'd love to go. All right. Their goal was to evoke from the student the sublime, evanescent knowledge that they knew to be embedded in the student's intelligence of the heart. This true education, involving experience, emotional impact, and work or action, causes the student to become the knowledge as opposed to remembering something. As Gurdjieff said, a man is what he knows. True education is an end in itself, yet it is also a means of consciousness evolution, for it incorporates its own form of suffering. The Temple of Man can teach the reader by means of Schwaller de Lubitz's experience rendered as his understanding. Our experience will be less rich, but understanding can develop because the ideas themselves vivify. How all the scholars within the Egyptological establishment how will the scholars react to this seminal work? A handful may pursue it, many will avoid, i.e. feign ignorance of, the Temple of Man. Some may describe the work as a concoction of Schwaller de Lubitz's fertile imagination. In this regard, it needs to be stated, no mere mortal ever in history or in the future could have an intelligence so vast, an imagination so fecund. I've never understood I've never looked it up. How do you pronounce that? Fecund. And an interrogative capacity. I understand what it means. I just have never known how to pronounce it. And an integrative capacity to complete as to have made up how somehow or other the contents of the Temple of Man. It proves itself in its very unimaginability. However, many of the teachings and unifying conceptions in it can be found in sources entirely independent of ancient Egyptian thought. Consider the science of correspondences, knowledge that underlies the ancient selection of symbols. Swedenborg, who lived during the 18th century and never visited Egypt, wrote at length on the subject of correspondences, and it became the title of one of his books. A section of Heaven and Hell is devoted to the subject. Quote, the most ancient people, who were celestial men, thought from correspondence itself as the angels do. The whole natural world corresponds to the spiritual world. The knowledge of correspondences is now wholly lost. And several short quotes there. Indeed, the seminal anthropocosmic, I've never seen that combination before, anthropocosmic principle upon which correspondence depends and that underlies pharaonic teaching is considered extensively by Swedenborg. He described the universe as the grand man and humanity as this in miniature. Schwaller de Lubitz uses the phrase Colossus of the universe as he confirms and amplifies all that Swedenborg told us in 1758. The Temple of Man is organized into 6 parts. It contains 44 chapters and it is presented in 2 large volumes. Chapter 27 onward concerns the particular architecture of the Temple of Luxor. These chapters contain 101 plates and about a third of the book's 300 figures. Kind of sounded like a book report, isn't it? These later chapters include commentaries on the plates and their subject matter. Occasionally, the style of presentation varies. As required by the topic, the earlier chapters form a basis for many of the later discussions. Some are difficult and some possibly are of lesser interest. When I felt that rereading a chapter would facilitate the growth of my understanding of it, I did so immediately. One must not be deterred by an apparent opacity of the text and the ideas therein that may be beyond present comprehension. Mental alchemy can and will occur, and I have actually discovered this with a couple of different books, that every time I reread the book, it's like I'm reading a whole different book than I've ever read before. It's like a brand new thing, and it's because a whole different layer of information becomes apparent for people who are serious Tai Chi practitioners. The Tao of Tai Chi Chuan Way of Rejuvenation is one of those. You can read it 100 times, and every time it's just like, how did I not get this before? Well, it's because you weren't ready for it. You had to grow into the knowledge. So, yeah. Okay, where are we? Mental alchemy can and will occur. Okay. Schwaller de Lubitz warns that effort is required. This effort is a form of suffering, and the ancient sages stated clearly that suffering is the engine for the evolution of consciousness. Quote, "It is suffering that causes the widening of consciousness, where suffering is understood as a profound experience brought about by the conflict of consciousness, not as sorrow." End quote. Acquiring just some of the pharaonic mentality is suffering itself, as the modern, quote, mechanistic mentality presents a formidable barrier, end quote. In Schwaller de Lubitz's words, he describes the nature of cerebral intelligence, ordinary thought, as constrictive and centripetal. Indeed, most of us live within the cage of ordinary consciousness established and maintained by the cerebral intelligence. Conversely, pharaonic mentality, the non-cerebral intelligence of the heart, is expansive, synthetic as opposed to analytic, intuitive, non-comparative, direct, and innate, and thus evoked. Getting there is one's personal death and life story. Suffer gladly. Schwaller de Lubitz wrote, "The Temple of Man," quote, "first to show the means of expression used by the ancients to transmit knowledge, and second, to present an outline of the doctrine of the anthropocosmos, the guide to the way of thinking of the sages." End quote. To fulfill this goal required the... Oh, my eyes just did something weird, sorry. To fulfill the goal required by the consideration of the discussions of subjects seldom seen in occult, esoteric, or spiritual writings, anthropocosmos, pharaonic calculation, cosmic principle of volume, the covered temple, the head, crossing, the knees, receiving, and giving are examples. One must acquire a good feeling for elements, consciousness, and irreducible magnitudes, as well as symbolique, L-I-Q-U-E, symbolique, to begin to fully appreciate all of these later chapters. This may take some time. As mentioned, however, even casual readers, that is, non-students, will find... I don't think you have to be a non-student to be a casual. Anyway, whatever. Will find wise statements everywhere. Conjectures verified now by time. This book is more than 40 years old, and remarkable insights. The pages contain such spiritual food, some of which may be ingested raw. Quote, the anthropocosmic doctrine holds that each plant and animal species represents a stage in the evolution of consciousness. Man is a microcosm of the macrocosm. Thus, the universe is incarnate in man and is nothing but potential man, anthropocosmos. End quote. In this system, creation and generation are central. The forces of genesis and the moment of expansion are the subject matter. Humanity, by the way, procreates but creates nothing. In applauding our pseudo-understanding of life because we genetically engineer a plant, clone a sheep, or grow a human pina ear on a mouse's back, we succumb to pride and self-delusion, our great foibles. Were modern humanity not so disordered in life, out of touch with nature and imbalanced as well, gaining pharaonic insights would still be difficult, but we have developed the cult of convenience to a high order and lived by another modern principle, that of something for nothing, inasmuch as in the spiritual realm, payment in a principle such a world view further amplifies the impediments toward pharaonic mentality. Boy, if he was writing this now, cult of convenience and something for nothing, that is absolutely where our society is right now, isn't it? Okay, and the Amun Temple at Luxor is another picture. The Amun Temple. The Amun Temple at Luxor. That's all it says. Those who have seen generally the hollowness of modern thought must be at pains to discover its effects in themselves. So invidious is its process. Invidious. Okay. The need to be surrounded by people, sound, activity, even noise arises in the psychological consciousness of the cerebral intelligence, which subsists on stimulation. Says Schwaller de Lubitz, most modern people, as of the 1950s, could not have stood the serenity that prevailed in ancient Egypt. Schwaller de Lubitz tells us that in order to grasp the essence of the anthropocosmic teaching, we need to re-establish in our minds a proper notion of the term symbol. A symbol is not merely any letter, quote, any letter or image that is substituted for the development of an idea, end quote. Instead, a symbol is a summarizing representation which is commonly called a synthesis. This process feels like something, often exhilaration. The ancients selected these symbols knowing virtually everything about the natural counterpart, the correspondent, from gestation to its death. Mental caution is necessary, however, and the tendency to fix, by definition, the essence of the symbolic representation must be avoided. The qualities of a symbol are many and varied and not to be linguistically rigidified any more than molten lava. The symbol is alive, vital, and dynamic because anthropocosmic doctrine is a vitalist philosophy. Quote, to explain the symbol is to kill it. And indeed, this landscape of academic Egyptology is everywhere strewn with the carcasses of dead, unheard symbols. Rational thinkers believe we've passed beyond simplistic thinking. Rather, in the last two millennia, we have fallen into it. We've fallen into simplistic thinking. The hypostyle hall at Luxor is, I think, our last picture. Okay. And our last two pages. Many concepts of modern thought are defined and understood differently in Temple of Man. So many, in fact, that scientists, academics, and people generally have unconsciously espoused a mechanical rationalism. Will be forced to reject the ideas out of hand. Quote, cause and effect are not separated by any time. Their existence a principle of the present moment, mystical in character, that modern science ignores, says Schwaller de Lubitz. These and other similar statements cannot be reconciled with the current and opposing worldview, but one may examine the modern socio-scientific technological state of the world in light of these ideas and, from so doing, draw tentative conclusions concerning the relative merit of the ancients' teachings. The history of science demonstrates that we seldom build upon the great discoveries of preceding generations of scientists. Few physicists today know Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Even fewer mathematicians appreciate that his unconventional use of the fractional notation of powers, e.g., x 2/3 power, and the unique position he accorded the number 5, which led to this, were a part of pharaonic mathematics thousands of years earlier. Modern science is as pouring from the empty into the void, to quote Gurdjieff. Modern science, Schwaller de Lubitz says, is founded upon incorrect premises. We know kinetic energy, not vital energy, and we tamper with forces, powers, and processes we do not and cannot now understand. We are the sorcerer's apprentice. Cerebral intelligence is based upon the sensory information conveyed to it by the major sensory organs. Sensory systems. Sorry, I don't know. I threw organs in there myself. These are understood by the ancients in terms of both their natural exoteric function to provide the brain with information and their esoteric spiritual function. One cannot but be amazed again by the subtlety of the insights they conveyed. For example, quote, the faculty of discernment located in the olfactory bulb is the seat of judgment in man, end quote. Well, the olfactory bulb is a so-called primitive structure of the brain with no direct connections to the cortex, the advanced gray matter. Nevertheless, apparently in deference to its unique anatomical characteristics, the ancients accorded olfaction one of the 3 secret sanctuaries in the head of the Luxor Temple, Room 5. The moral sense, sexuality, and the physiological distribution of vital energy are combined in the relevant symbol, the cobra. Here in Room 5 of the temple is located conscience. Goodness has a spiritual fragrance, a fact noted by Swedenborg, who mentioned that the ancient Egyptians were the last to fully understand the science of correspondences. Subtlety is all the more difficult to acknowledge and recognize when what is taught conflicts diametrically with what people already believe. Ironically, we seldom have evidence that appears to contradict the ancients' teachings, which typically go beyond our accepted facts. Schwaller de Lubitz includes a lengthy discussion of the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus. This papyrus from Luxor in 1862 was translated after 1920 by the renowned Egyptologist J.H. Breasted. The effort convinced him of the elevated status of ancient Egyptian science and mathematics, as it did others, but apparently modern Egyptologists remain uninfluenced by his writing. An extensive anatomical dictionary of the skull, head, and throat, also in hieroglyphics, enables the reader to comprehend the many cases of head injury described in the papyrus. Despite the ancients' lack of a really good source of head injury cases, e.g. automobile accidents, their knowledge of clinical neuroanatomy was detailed and correct, without the benefit of EEGs, CAT scans, and magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. The ancients described a human as comprising three interdependent beings, each having its own body and organs. Of course, all were essential and important. However, the head was especially so, for it was the seat of the spiritual being. There, the blood was spiritualized, infused, and with vital energy prior to coursing through the corporeal and sexual bodies. These bodies, vivified by the spiritual being, live a lifetime without knowing it in a state of ignorance or self-delusion. Modern humanity has struck an iceberg of its own making. Those forces we have tampered with and let loose, but which we do not understand, threaten our annihilation. We have a role in cosmic metabolism, but are unable to fulfill it. We must cease fiddling while our planet burns, cease occupying ourselves with liposuction, with killing birds to kill insects, with poisoning the soil to kill weeds, with polluting air and water. Any sane person can see our way of life has become unnatural, a condition the ancients foresaw. Everyone's consciousness needs to expand, to evolve. We need to become aware of a great deal that, right now, escapes us. This can occur by choice. The price is some suffering. Quote, "And now that the temple of Luxor has shown us the way to follow, let us begin to explore the deeper meaning of the teaching of the Pharaonic sages," wrote Schwaller de Lubitz. "We shall discover along the way what a trivial price we are asked to pay." The end. That's the end of that. And like I said, there are three shorter articles. First one is Fingerprinting the Gods. That is 2, 4, 6 pages. Then the Central American Mystery, about Mesoamerica, which is 6.5 pages. And then Destination Galactic Center, talking about the ancient Maya, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, a little over 6 pages. So they're all fairly short. And then that will take us to part 4 of the book, Searching for the Fountainhead, which gets into Atlantis stuff. So we'll finish that next week. And I'm really looking forward to the Atlantis stuff, but I want to read everything in this book. So that'll be it for this week. I'm going to take a break, pour a cocktail, and then I'm going to come back and play some Fallout 3 in another stream here in a little bit. So we will see you in a while.